Well, good morning. I'm so excited to be here, to connect, to hang out, to be able to share what God's Word has to say this morning. And for those of you that don't know me, my name's Justin. I'm the executive pastor, and we're continuing on our series, Rescuer. And I just really quickly want to say hey to everybody that's in the Mass-only gathering. I'm really excited to have you with us as well. And David and Megan are over there hosting you. So thank you, David and Megan. Appreciate that. And for all of you that are online as well, Anthony's your online host. And so thanks for being in the room with us this way and engaging and connecting today. So just as we get started, I'd love to just share with you a movie that I recently watched, and maybe you've seen, but it just, and I'd seen it before, but it just hit me in a different way. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Cinderella Man, right? Directed by Ron Howard, and it tells the story. If you didn't, it's okay. I'll tell you a little bit about it. It tells the story of the rise and fall and comeback of James J. Braddock, the Bulldog, as a pro boxing great of the 1930s Depression era. And it's just a beautiful story. It's got Russell Crowe and Renee Zellweger in it, and they just do a phenomenal job. But part of the movie, and what I just think super neat, is just the comeback of it all. And so his story is after he lost everything in the stock market. He was an up-and-coming boxer, and he loses everything in the stock market. And so he starts taking bouts when he's not healthy, not at 100%, in order to make enough money to support his family, which ultimately gets him so battered and beat down that he washes out. They actually take away his license, and he tries to get work as a factory dock worker, but poverty is ravaging his family. Right? And you just see in the movie, in vivid depiction, his kids are starving. His wife doesn't have enough. They're watering down the milk. The heat is turned off in a frozen tundra of New Jersey winter. And the kids are getting sick. And all the while, and there's just this scene. There's this scene where, I guess back in the Depression era, what some families did when they couldn't afford to feed their kids, they would send them away to a relative so they could hopefully make enough. But if their kids didn't have enough, they couldn't stay in the home. And so there's this scene where one of Russell Crowe's sons, Braddock's sons, steals a salami from the butcher. And so then he calls him out, says, you can't steal. And he takes it back. He confronts, just gives it back to the butcher. There's this beautiful scene. He's like, son, why'd you do that? He said, I was afraid that if we didn't have enough to eat, you'd send us away. And then you just see Russell Crowe like, it's just not even his son, right? I mean, it's an actor, right? So he just holds him, and there's just this moment, and I'm just weeping, okay? I remember seeing it in 2005 in college, and I was like, that's a fantastic movie. But now, I'm like heavy sobbing on the couch. It's the middle of the night, super weird. I was just sucked in. I started to lose it. My heart is just filled with so much compassion for this fictitious family, And later on, he starts to get healthy. They give him back his license for an exhibition, and he does great. He starts to make the comeback of comebacks. And they interview him and they say, Braddock, what are you fighting for? And he says, I fight for milk. And I'm like, oh my goodness. I just lose it. I just lose it. I didn't do that when I first saw it, but 15 years and a bunch of kids changes your perspective on life. It just does. It hit me. And the challenge is, with all that, I saw that movie, and I was just really moved in a way that I wasn't moved in my youth. Except there was a bit of conviction, because a few days later, I was at Walmart. I was at Walmart, and there's a young woman that had a sign. She just was in need and help, and needed help. And I remember registering that I saw her and thinking, you're a little bit young to be out here doing this. You're a little bit young to have been so badly beaten down by life. But I did not stop. And in my mind, I don't know what I thought. I don't know if there was judgment, or I don't know what I thought. If maybe my prevailing thought of the day was, I just don't have time. I got to keep moving. I wasn't planning on doing this. There's a lot of other people that could help, right? I've got all these rationalizations, all these excuses in my mind. And it created a little bit of conviction in me, because here I am moved by a fictitious family, and yet there's a young woman that needs help, and I'm not thinking about her pain. I'm not thinking about her brokenness. I'm not even considering how humiliated she may be out there asking for help. to be that broken in her life. I just didn't want to let myself feel any of it. I didn't allow myself to. Many of us, I just think maybe you've got a story that's similar to mine, maybe you don't, but many of us, it's easy to kind of cut ourselves off and not want to feel the real life around us. Right? There can be a breakdown of compassion in our hearts and minds sometimes. And nobody plans for it to happen. Nobody wakes up and is like, I'm not going to be compassionate today. No one thinks that. But there is a kind of numbness that sets in. I think some of that numbness comes from how overwhelming the world can feel. And the world feels at any given moment. We have more information at our fingertips now than we've ever had before. We have more testimonies at our fingertips now than we've ever had before. I remember being a kid of the 80s and 90s, and the only poverty you knew about was the poverty you saw. The only divorce you knew about was the divorce you experienced or the divorce you saw. The only tragedy you could think of was the people in your relationships or your neighbors or friends. It was just who you knew. Who you knew determined the pain you were exposed to. But now, oh my goodness, we've got GoFundMe requests to cover the costs of expenses of just terrible tragedies, of people we'll never meet, we never know. And it's right at our fingertips. We've got testimonies on Facebook and YouTube of just sharing just these tough stories of brokenness. There are an infinite number of Google searches that can bring these stories right to your face. And we're inundated with it. Public pain. Things like drug addiction in our county, divorce rates in our county, sickness and fatality in our county are online and at a very easy to see map and chart. That's public pain. And then in my context, we get to hear a lot of the community stories, a lot of the private pain. There's a lot of things that come into our ministry support center. So much filters through. We get calls. We have desperate prayer requests for healing for sick people that people love so much. Just petitioning God to move. We read it and we pray. I don't know what to do. We get the heat and electricity shut-off notices. We hear about that. We hear the stories of job losses and what that means for people. And how much people are hurting in the fear of job loss or not being able, I've lost my job and I'm not able to find another. We hear the stories of eviction notices. We hear the stories of spouses leaving and all of the kids, and I don't know what to do. We get the stories of divorce heartbreak. We see the prayer requests where we just hear people petition, Lord, please move on my spouse's heart. Please change their heart. Please bring them back. Help me forgive them. I don't know. Name it. We've probably got a prayer request on it. We hear people that go without life-saving or life-improving prescription drugs because they can't afford them. Those are the things that's the things that we get to hear about. So in the world, in my context, there's all this stuff that not everybody hears. I'm not going to share specifics, of course. I'm just saying it's right there. It's inundating. And here is the tension that I experience as a Jesus follower. I am not allowed to forget it. I can't let it go. I'm not allowed to do nothing, but I can't fix it. I can't forget it and I can't fix it. I'm not allowed to not do anything. I have to observe it. I have to be a part of it. I have to lean in, but I can't fix it. So I'm stuck in this tension, kind of. And maybe you are too. In fact, even if you're not a Jesus follower, I think at your core there's a similar tension. There's a similar feeling. Nobody wants to sit in it. Nobody wants to sit in this tense moment. Nobody wants to feel bad or guilty all the time or feel like they can't fix it, but maybe they should do more and they just stuck there. And these are the moments that we can let a numbness kind of come in. And we have a term for it. We've coined it. It's called compassion fatigue. We call it compassion fatigue. It feels like numbness. Yet when I look at Jesus, and this is, I think, the really neat thing. It's one of the many neat things of Jesus. Numbness is not at all how he reacted to needs. It's not how he responded to the brokenness around him. that kind of indifference is not love. That lack of empathy, there is no love in that. And that's why as we're looking through at the life of Jesus and spending time with Jesus, learning about him, investing in that relationship and rescuer, what I find so impressive about Jesus and what draws me into him is the way he was always able to do good and never get tired. The amount of mercy and compassion he possesses and his resolve with that. And can you just imagine, anytime we're like, hey, can you imagine being Jesus? Be like, not really, you know? But can you just step out for just a moment and think about his skill sets, his abilities? See, there are times I don't know what brokenness exists in a person, and so my lack of action is because I straight up don't know. But Jesus was acutely aware of every bit of it. Every bit of it he knew. And get this, he left places. He was on a mission, and he left places before he had a chance to heal everybody. And sometimes he didn't even heal anybody in those places. And yet, because he knows everything, I imagine he knows the exact pain and could see every single face of every single person that was there, and he left. But he never got tired of doing good. He never felt guilty for not doing enough. He never became numbed out. He never got overwhelmed and tired to the point of inaction at the brokenness of it all. How did he do it? How did he do that? Well, the easy answer is, he's God. Well, that's fair. How did he do it? And how do I develop a compassion for others like that? How do I develop compassion for others like that? This is the question we really want to be looking at and what we're going to kind of like dive into our story with, looking at this dimension, this aspect of Jesus. And as we're responding to this and as I share the story, I want to be really upfront with something. We're going to look at a story and it's going to involve a couple key characters. It's going to have a dad and it's going to have this woman in the story. Now, let me say this. Jesus, when we talk about developing compassion, Jesus didn't develop it. He just had it perfectly. We can't look at Jesus and say, this is how we grow up in compassion. That doesn't work. But what we can do is we're going to look at this dad and this woman's journey, and we're going to follow their lead as far as developing a heart of compassion. And yet, what we want to be like is Jesus, so we want to follow his lead. So we're going to look at the way they developed, but we're going to look at how Jesus is, and we're going to copy him. We're going to follow his lead. Sound good? I just want to caveat all that. So let's jump into our story. We're actually going to be in Mark 5. So if you're looking at the second half of your Bible, it's Matthew, Mark. That's it. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are the four Gospels that tell the story of the life of Jesus. They're the first four books of the New Testament. And we're going to be in Mark 5, and I'll just kind of set the context a little bit. I know where we've been in this series, but there's a lot that happens between where we've been and what's going on now. So Jesus and his disciples have when this story happens, they've sailed across the Sea of Galilee, which I think I looked and it's like maybe 8 to 12 miles long. So it's kind of a significant distance. So they've sailed across it and back. And on the way there, that's when a storm breaks loose, which can happen on the Sea of Galilee. And the disciples are terrified and afraid that they're going to drown. Jesus is asleep, which he's sleeping through a storm, you know. They wake Jesus up and they say, we're going to drown. Jesus is like, no, you're not, because I'm here. And he just speaks and calms the storm. Very impressive. And they're like, who is this guy? So they finish sailing. They get to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And immediately they're responding to, and they're confronted with this guy who's possessed by a bunch of demons. Jesus heals him, casts it out, puts him in his right mind. And word begins to spread. So they get back in the boat after some time, head back across the Sea of Galilee. And this is where our story picks up, because Jesus is teaching on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and then there is an interruption, and it allows the mercy, compassion, love, and power of God to be put on display. And this is where our story starts. Jesus is teaching. And then in Mark 5:22, it says, one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, my little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. I want to linger here for a moment. This is a bold thing. He's in the middle of teaching, and a guy throws himself down at his feet and says, my little girl Now, I read this before, and now I have little girls, and so I'm just like already getting weepy. But I don't want us to overlook the tension or the impact of this statement. Think about it. One of the synagogue leaders, don't let the significance of the tension of this moment pass you by, because there is significant tension between Jesus and the synagogue class, the synagogue rulers, the teachers of the law. Who Jairus represents and who Jesus is, there's a lot of tension right there. Religious leaders, teachers of the law, synagogue leaders, they opposed Jesus' ministry. Here's how. A few weeks ago, we looked at how they tried to throw him off a cliff. So yeah, that's pretty tension-filled. Not long before this event, Jesus had healed a man on the Sabbath and restored the function of his hand, and they were upset, jealous, envious, angry, furious, it says. And they looked at how they might get him. That's when they started talking about it. That just happened. The religious elite, guys like Jairus, they judged Jesus for hanging out with tax collectors and with sinners. And then he would correct them with that. And they'd say, you're only able to do the power, you're doing it because of the power of Satan and his demons. To try to discredit him, to try to devalue him, to try to harm his reputation. In fact, it gets so intense later on that they threaten to throw anybody, any Jew out of the synagogue who speaks of Jesus or admits something about Jesus or even believes that Jesus is the Messiah. So the tension is thick. Jairus is on team synagogue. He's on team religious elite. He's on the other team, and the tension is big. We don't know a ton about him. His name's mentioned, but we don't know much about him. He's probably a prominent, wealthy dude, probably high standing. He's a leader of a synagogue. I don't know how big the community is, but that means something. But the thing is, if you can just if you can imagine the humility for a moment, because here he is on the other team, and yet my little girl's on the line. So he breaks ranks. He breaks party lines. And in humble desperation, throws himself down at the feet of this man that he may not like, but he thinks something about. And not only is Jesus, but he's surrounded by uneducated fishermen. And this prominent, reputable dude throws himself down. It's not just Jairus at the feet of Jesus that day. It's everything that Jairus identifies with. It's his identity at the feet of Jesus that day. So how's Jesus going to respond? How's he going to respond? How will Jesus respond to something like this? Because Jairus is literally asking from Jesus maybe the very thing he's condemned Jesus for. And Jesus could have responded a lot of different ways. I mean, this is an interruption, right? This is quite an interruption. And there would have been many responses that would have been fair. Jesus could have told Jairus, here's the thing, man. You make it difficult for people I am trying to reach to come to me, so I want none of you. He could have just let it go. And the thing is, Jesus is all-knowing. He knows Jairus is going to do this. He could have just avoided the whole scene, be like, boop, boop, never mind, He knows all things. He allowed that moment to happen. It would have been fair. He's God. He also, and this is something I thought about, he also could have told Jairus, hey, I don't have time. And I don't need to be there to touch your daughter. I don't need to heal her. I don't need to go with you. Let me just say the word. I don't have time for you. We don't get along. I don't have time for you. He could have said all these things, and we just are like, that's not really the character of Jesus, and thank goodness it's not. Because Jesus leans into the broken. Jesus never casts out broken people. Ever. 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 And if that's you, you can go to him with your brokenness and he will not cast you out either. That may be your story. In that moment, Jesus saw Jairus and gave him a mercy he didn't deserve. He said yes, he leaned into the need. It says this, Jesus went with him. a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And so if you can just picture the scene, if you're one of the disciples that day, this is the moment where you're getting in the ambulance and you're going, right? Because you've just been commissioned on a rescue mission. You jump in the ambulance like, we're going to heal the daughter of a prominent person. And there's a crowd, and they're like, imagine just weaving. They're not really in an ambulance. This is the first century, so, right? So they're just kind of weaving around crowds. It's like, we're on a rescue mission. Adrenaline's pumping. It's like, yes, let's go, let's go. This is intense. This is the moment. They're like, yes. But there was someone else in the crowd that day, and it's going to upend the whole story. There was another in the crowd, and she was desperate and broken. A woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years. And she'd suffered a great deal. She suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors. She spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. This woman is desperate. Think Jairus for a moment, just think this woman for a moment. She's desperate. She's physically weak. She's emotionally broken. She's socially ostracized. See, back then, this condition, she would have been unclean. They probably would have thrown her out of the synagogue. That means not only does she physically weak, but she's got no community. I don't know, but she could have spent the last 12 years alone. 12 years of loneliness. And if Jairus is there with everybody, just think about this. I don't know, but was she in Jairus' synagogue? Was he the dude that threw her out? I don't know. But that's going to be really weird in a second. Right? This kind of moment, the community would have been talking, I think the rumors around the rumor mill. People are wondering like, oh, did God curse her? Is that why she's this way? Is that why? What sin did she do that God cursed her so badly? All of this stuff, this moment. And she spent everything she had. I don't know if she's a woman of means at one point, but she isn't now. She's got nothing. Alone, destitute, broken, poor. This is her. The world had beaten her down. And yet, here's the thing about her. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. Because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And I want you to think for a moment, just to last week, this is totally the come and see stage. Because that's not great theology. It's not about faith. She's like, I think if I just touch his clothes, the magic will happen. I'm not knocking her. I just hope that's really hopeful if you're at the come and see stage. Because something's going to happen for her in a moment that she could have never predicted. And all she did was come and see when she heard about. I heard something about this guy. It wasn't the strength of her faith. It wasn't the quality, the depth. It wasn't the theological accuracy and understanding of her faith. I'm not even entirely sure who she thought Jesus was at this moment. But she goes to him, and that is the key. Jesus is the object of her faith. It wasn't about how much she had. It wasn't how deep. It wasn't how accurate. It wasn't any of those things. It was simply that Jesus was who she put her faith in. And so she does this, and this is what happens. This is the outcome. I hope that's just an encouragement if you're at the come and see stage. I'm not saying you'll be magically healed. I'm just saying it starts there. And immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And this doesn't always say this of Jesus, but this is what happens at once. Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" He's surrounded by a crowd. Like the language for this crowd is that it's thronging. In other words, it's like pressing in so tight, it's hard to breathe. And Jesus in this moment, who touched my clothes? And when you see the disciples' reaction, they're a little incredulous and they're a little bit sarcastic, which I don't know if I'd be sarcastic with Jesus. I think I'd just be straight up, okay? But here's what he says. Here's what they say. He asks, "Who touched my clothes?" And they say, "You see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" Like, nobody wants to be the disciple that's like, duh, Jesus. You just don't want to be. You're like, you be that guy. I don't want to be that guy. This isn't something I do, but there's sarcasm, there's incredulousness in this moment. And if you're imagining, they're like in ambulance mode still. Like they're going through the crowd. They're ready. They're pumped up. There's adrenaline. They know they're going to go save this little girl's life. And then Jesus is like, wait a second. Somebody touched me. Somebody touched me. Who touched me? I don't know if he said it. I don't know how soft it was. But who touched me? Power's gone out from me. And they're like, everybody's touching you. And you got to think this is like an inconvenient, maybe interruption. We're in ambulance mode, we're going, and you're stopping to find out who's touched you. This guy's daughter's dying. And it says this, he doesn't just do that in verse 32. It says he kept looking around. So he asked the question, nobody comes forward. Because if you're that woman, it's like, I don't know if I want to be the one to come forward either. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. He kept looking around. And if you're in the crowd that day, if you're one of the disciples that day, if you're Jairus that day, you maybe are thinking, why are we stopping for an interruption like this? Why are we stopping? It might, and for everybody else, it may have felt like an inconvenience, but to Jesus, it was absolutely an opportunity to lean into an invitation. That's Jesus. I don't know what Jairus is thinking. Maybe there's just kind of this anxious frustration of like, oh, we got to get going. We got to get going. She's not looking good. She didn't look good when I left. I wouldn't be here if there were any other chance. I just imagine this as a dad, like the tension's really gut-wrenching. Gut-wrenching. And the woman, he's looking around because she doesn't own it. But do you think she's terrified? For one, she was unclean and she touched him. Also, if she feels she took power from him, if she owns it, will he take it back? Is he going to humiliate her? I mean, she's heard something about him, but she doesn't maybe know who he is. Not like you and I do when we get to look at the whole story of his life and we see his character. It says, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. She told him the whole truth. Broken, desperate moment, and she lets Jesus into her need, right? Jesus is already leaning into those interruptions as invitations, and she, in this period of brokenness, she just lets Jesus right into her need and shares everything. And what do you think's going through Jairus' mind now? I don't know if he knew the woman, because now she's been identified. And he's like, oh, I know that lady. That's the lady we don't talk to. The irony is not lost on me. This is so neat. Both broken, in desperate need for Jesus, shoulder to shoulder at his feet. And here's the thing. She tells him the whole truth. There's this moment, and you look at the scene, and Jairus says nothing. He says nothing. He's not like, Jesus, are we going to keep going? And I think him saying nothing is maybe the most telling thing about him. Because there's not the pride that's there. There's not the grumbling of like, I'm so much better than this woman. See, when I find myself in a similar place, I got to find myself in a similar place. And when I do, there's a question that pops into my mind that I want to hold on to, and I want to invite you to hold on to. What makes me more deserving than them of the love of God? I believe that is the heart of compassion. What makes me more deserving than them? And maybe that's why Jairus was silent that day. I don't know. But I just love this next interaction with Jesus. She lets Jesus into her need, and then he leans into it. And this is what happens. He said to her, and I love this, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. It's so loving. It's so gentle. It's so tender. And he calls her daughter. And the thing is, do you know what's at stake if Jesus doesn't stop? Maybe we do on the other side of things. I don't know if she knew. If Jesus doesn't stop, her faith is on the line. She may walk away her whole life thinking, I took this. And when Jesus turns and says, it's your faith, it's not about touching my cloak. It's not magic. It's your faith that healed you. Then she sees it for the free gift that it is, and she experiences the grace of Jesus. Her faith is on the line. That's what no one else could see, but Jesus was acutely aware of. Oh, and he calls her daughter. And do you think at that moment, Jairus is just thinking of his daughter? And just realizing in this moment that Jesus sees this woman the same way he sees this little girl in that bed back home? And do you think like maybe that moment, not only is it just so loving, that's Jesus, is so loving for the woman in that moment, but for Jairus, it's exactly what his heart might need in that moment. Anyway, where others may have seen inconvenience, Jesus sees invitation. And I'll just say this is the full power of the gospel on display. This is the grace of Jesus on display. Think about it. They're both at the feet of Jesus with brokenness and need, shoulder to shoulder. But this is the thing, this is about Jesus. You've got this guy who's maybe wealthy, high and prominent, community leader, high standing, and he's here, and he is shoulder to shoulder in need at the feet of Jesus with this woman who's got nothing. And she goes first. That's the gospel. That's what Jesus has done. And he calls her daughter because you and I, when we come to faith in Jesus, we're adopted in his children. Power goes out from him. He loses power. He gives his power away so that she can be made clean. And I'm telling you, she was made clean through the crowd that day. But you and I, he let his power go for us on the cross so that we could become sons and daughters, so that we could become clean and made right from all sin. And when I come face to face with that reality, that love and that grip, what makes me more deserving than them? What makes me more deserving than anyone else? Gospel's on display. Love of God's on display. And then came the moment that Jairus feared, was anxious about. It says, while Jesus was still speaking to her, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? She's gone, man. Why bother the teacher anymore? And I don't know. This is, I imagine just like head in hands. I don't know if he's got his friends propping him up. I don't know what it's like to walk through the crowd that day. But I just imagine that's the lowest of low. That's the most broken, that desperation. And then overhearing what they said, Jesus told, oh my goodness, Jesus hears this. And he could have said nothing and just kept going, but he stops and he says to Jairus, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, just believe. Don't be afraid, just believe. And I don't know why he used that phrase. Why not, don't be angry? Why not, don't be sad? Why not, don't be grieved? Why not, don't be hurt? Why don't be afraid? Because I think he knew in Jairus' mind, death was the worst that life had to throw at anybody. And I think what Jesus is trying to communicate is, I've got the power. I've got the keys over sin and death. Don't be afraid. It has no power over me, I think Jesus is saying. So they're continuing to go, don't be afraid, just believe. And he didn't allow anyone to follow him except Peter, James, and John, that inner circle, that community. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jairus, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly because it's a little girl that's passed. And he went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead but asleep. And that sounds incredible. That sounds ridiculous. Unless that's all death is to your power. And that's Jesus. But they laughed at him because they're like, no, she's dead. This story is also written by Luke, who was a doctor. She's dead. But they laughed at him. And after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. And he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Here he is. You're not supposed to touch dead people. And he didn't need to, but he leans in. He touches untouchable people. That's the heart of compassion. That's what I want towards people. And this is so cool. So this story is in Matthew, it's in Mark, it's in Luke. It's in 3 of the Gospels. They're like, this story is worth putting in there. And the thing is, there's detail. This story has detail the other ones just don't include. This Aramaic phrase, talitha kum, which does mean that. But see, most scholars think that it's even more gentle, even more affectionate, that it's more kind of like just a term of endearment, almost like, honey, it's time to get up. Sweetie, it's time to get up. Which means here is Jesus staring down the worst nemesis, death, that life has to throw at any of us. And he wakes this little girl up like I get my girl from bed in the morning. When I get my daughter up for school, it's gentle. It's, honey, it's time to get up. That's how Jesus brings people back from the dead. Are you kidding me? He doesn't roll up his sleeves. He doesn't like crack his knuckles. He doesn't say presto changeo and start doing a bunch. No, it's just, honey, it's time to get up. You've been asleep long enough. Are you kidding me? It's because he is God and he holds the power over sin and death. And he mastered it. And on the cross, he took it away. He took away its power once and for all. So immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. And at this, they were completely astonished. And he told them, give her something to eat, because I guess coming back from the dead leaves you with an appetite. And I guess he would know. He would know. That's the end of the story. That's the end of that story. And there are others of compassion. But oh my goodness. How do I develop a compassion for others like that? How do I do that? Now, remember, we're looking at this story. Our journey to compassion is going to follow the characters, but how we live it out, that's going to follow Jesus. See, for you and I, compassion is this. We feel the brokenness and pain of others, but we don't judge them or blame them. It's feeling brokenness and pain of others without judging them or blaming them. So how do we feel without the judgment? How do we have this kind of compassion? See, it's really easy to rationalize all the judgments for compassion. It's easy to rationalize judgments. In my self-talk, when it comes to compassion, when it comes to rationalizing judgments, see, because compassion is all about just seeing pain, seeing brokenness, but without judging people, without blaming people, without shaming people. How do I do that? Well, I've got all this self-talk, these judgments, and maybe you've said this. I made my own way. Nobody gave me a handout. You did this to yourself. See that? You did this to yourself. This is a consequence of your decisions. Man, it's so easy to look at people in pain and just say like, I feel bad, but you did this to yourself. And I just don't know if that's compassion. For me, I've used it as a rationalization to do nothing. See, I look at all of those things I could say and all of the rationalizations for judgment and shame and blame giving. And I just see them, they're mental, they're logical, but they're a heart issue. They reflect the condition of my heart. Because here's the thing, I told you about that woman at Walmart. And here's the thing. In that moment, like I probably had some thoughts, maybe even ones I wasn't aware of, and I can just say, oh, that's logical. I don't have time. I don't have the resources. Somebody else will do it. Or I don't know what brought her to this, but you know what? If I could do one thing, but one decision probably didn't put her in this situation. One decision's not going to get her out. So I guess I'll do nothing, you know. And I could just look at that and say, it's so logical. But here's the thing. If that were my wife or one of my daughters, I don't have any excuses. My love and my value for them overshadow everything. And that means it's not a mental thing. It's not a logical thing. It's a heart thing. I may call it compassion fatigue. I may call it numbness, but it is heart-heartedness. That's my problem. And I think the only way to remove judgment or blame from us and to have this heart of compassion is in this. Only when I feel the brokenness in my place of need am I able to feel compassion for the brokenness of others. Only when I feel broken am I able to feel the brokenness of others truly, without judgment, without blame, without shame. Only when I feel the brokenness in my place of need am I able to feel compassion for the brokenness of others. That's because that's the story. Both characters, incredibly broken, incredibly desperate, and they come to Jesus with their need, and he leans into it. This is essential if you and I are going to develop a heart of compassion for others. And in life, you maybe know this to be true. We're compassionate to those that we have similar experiences with. When we know what it's like to be somebody else, we feel a little bit more for that person. Unless I'm at my knees at the feet of Jesus, it's really hard to have a soft heart. Because I think what happens is comparison creeps in. When I compare myself to somebody else, because that's what brokenness does. Brokenness forces me to think about myself in terms of Jesus. But if I don't have that, I think about myself in terms of someone else. And that means if I look at myself here, and I look at this person here in my mind, right? And I can conclude it's like, I'm not so bad. I'm not so bad. My judgments, my shame, my guilt, they're justified towards them. The feeling of superiority I feel, maybe I deserve it. But when I look at Jesus and I'm before him, that's when I realize, my arms are not wide enough, but I'm down here. That's about as good as I can get. And I realize I am so messed up. Once I see myself as I am, if I'm down here and I'm thinking somebody else to my right or left, I just kind of throw it away because I'm I guess we're all shoulder to shoulder anyway, aren't we? That's what brokenness does. Right? Only when I feel the brokenness in my place of need am I able to feel compassion for the brokenness of others. When I'm shoulder to shoulder, it makes me ask the question, what makes me more deserving of compassion than them? That's what brokenness does. If you want to develop a heart, that's how. For me, I have to have compassion. For me to have compassion, I've got to be broken. I've got to be desperately aware of my need. And then I'm able to do what Jesus said, which is love your neighbor as Christ loved you. And he loved us with compassion in our time of brokenness. That's what we got to be about. So as we wrap it up here, I think you and I think we can develop compassion, more compassion, by looking towards 3 steps. And this is where I want to be practical. But there are 3 steps, I think, to develop more compassion in our hearts. And they require an act of God. First is this: become aware of your brokenness. We see it in the story. Jairus is aware of his brokenness and his need. The woman was aware of her brokenness and need. I think if you want to be more compassionate, you got to come to grips with it. Become aware of your brokenness before Jesus. And then come to Jesus in desperate need. Come to Jesus in desperate need. He never casts out the broken. His love, his grace is sufficient for you. We see it in the story. The characters did it because it's true of God's character. And I'll just say this, if you want to do this, if this is where you're at, please let the person who brought you know, please let us know that you want to come to Jesus today. And the last thing is, and we see this of Jesus, lean in to feel the hurt of others. Lean in. Jesus goes with Jairus. He stops on the way to encourage this woman. He leans in. Then when Jairus is hurting like he's never hurt before, he leans in. Then when he's got to heal this little girl, he leans in. He just leans all over the place. It's what he does. If you're going to do this, I'm going to tell you, you are going to be faced with a question. Because interruptions happen, and you have to determine whether you will see them as an inconvenience or whether you will see them as an invitation. And that's why I want to encourage you to accept interruptions as invitations. What have you overheard in the office? What need have you overheard in the office, across the cubicle wall? Whether it's somebody needs to talk, whether somebody needs something, whether a meal is at play here, I don't know. What needs have you heard? And I want to say, if you've heard it, you may see, I don't have time for that. Lean in to the invitation. You may be exactly the person who is supposed to hear. Who in your life needs you to linger in conversation just for an extra moment? Who do you need to start a conversation with because they just need to know in their life that another human being cares about them? If you got somebody, lean in to the invitation. Not an interruption, not an inconvenience. It's an invitation. Lean into it. What warning flares has your spouse sent up that he or she just needs help? Where do you need to serve your kids or speak with your kids a little bit more? What direction do their little lives need? And I'm just going to tell you, use compassion. Be compassionate. Lean in to the invitation. I think if you will develop compassion, if you and I will go after compassion this way, then I think everyday activities become eternal opportunities. That's what I think. And your compassion in the life of another person could change the trajectory of that person's story forever. That's why it's so critical that you and I develop a heart of compassion. And compassion is really what communion is all about, because this is going to be our opportunity to respond. That's what communion, that's the beauty and the joy and celebration of communion. It is compassion on display. It's compassion on display because, like you and I, we can come to Jesus with our brokenness. We can come with our need. On the cross, it was Jesus who allowed himself to be broken and allowed himself to experience need for us. And it's that love that is transformative. And it's the only thing that allowed us to do what we're talking about today. We can go to Jesus with our brokenness because we know he has the power. Because he allowed himself to be broken. He allowed himself to experience need. And so when he gave that command in that room with those guys that day and talked about communion and said, drink this. This is my blood poured out for you. Drink this. This is my body broken for you. Eat this. When he did that, man, it was such a reminder of the compassion of Christ. And for you, I want it to be that today. I want it to be that for us. So I'm going to pray in just a moment, and I'll just say this. I've got mine up with me because I actually remembered it, but I so often forget. If you need to grab one in the back, please don't hesitate to do so. But let's pray together. Father, speak to us. Show us what our next step is and what you've got for each one of us. You are good. There is none like you. We love you. And we pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.